Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Robson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Kelvin Smith Library, and we want to welcome you to the library and to the first of our third annual series of digital library lectures. Some of you have been to our programs in the past where our speakers have included such luminaries in the digital library world as John Unsworth and Kate Wittenberg. Kenny Cruz talked about copyright, and last year, right about this time, Siva Vaidyanathan was here, who has lately been receiving quite a lot of notoriety. So we're always glad to get people on the cusp of fame, and I think we have another situation like that today. There is a pile of the brochures for this series at the back of the room on the table back there, so I encourage you to avail yourself of the flyer at the end of the program. This series is funded by the Mario M. Marino Fund for the Innovation and Application of Advanced Information Technologies and the David R. Bender Endowment Fund for Library Staff Development here at Kelvin Smith Library, and we are very grateful to have those two endowments that give us the opportunity to present this information to you. Our next lecture in the series will be on Thursday, November 1st, 1:30 p.m., again here in the Dampier Room. Mark Kornblue, who is the director of Matrix, the Center for Humane Arts, Letters, and Social Sciences at Michigan State University, will be here to talk about digital libraries and cyber infrastructure. And apparently his talk is not quite as daunting as the title might imply. I've heard him speak in the past. He's a very engaging speaker. He's been involved with a number of high-profile and influential digital library projects, including one called the National Gallery of the Spoken Word, which is maybe his most famous thing so far, but he has a wide influence in the profession. I'm very happy today to welcome to the podium our speaker, Stephen Chapman, who is the manager of the Open Collections program at Harvard University. Formerly, he was the preservation librarian for digital initiatives at Harvard. He's well known in the digital library world for his research and writings and many appearances at conferences and talks that he has given. Joanne Eustace and I heard him talk last spring at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill at a conference on digital curation and preservation, and after we heard that talk, we thought, oh, well, he's one that we want to get on the agenda for this series, and we're very happy to have him with us today. So please welcome Stephen Chapman.
Well, thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. I thank Joanne and Tim and everyone for inviting me, and echo the gratitude for the funds to support this series. I take it upon myself to do all of my reading and to get up to date on things when I'm asked to speak, and I always look forward to the opportunities to have conversations before and after this to just exchange viewpoints on things related to digital libraries. So any opportunities to collaborate, both formal and informal, I think are tremendously healthy, and even if we take the self-serving approach to just trying to get things done within our own organizations, I think it's very, very important to have opportunities like this to just try to frame issues and frame questions when we're at such an early stage of trying to figure out all of this. So again, thank you for inviting me and for creating this forum to exchange these kinds of ideas about digital libraries. I have a background in preservation, but I hope that this talk about context will have a broader context of digital library development, and within that, of course, one of the mandates is to find ways to preserve things. So I think with that, I'll just dive in and say that the talk or part of the title of the talk comes from Emerson, and it's a famous quotation. And so, you know, Emerson writing about nature and human place in the world is talking about the mutable the inherent mutability of nature. And I think that, although we're talking about a more modest domain than the world in talking about digital libraries or preservation within, I really feel that a primary or sort of overarching context for digital library work is the internet. It's the web. It's where our users are. And in my experience, so much of user expectations are really guided by this constellation of heavily visited sites on the internet that may or may not have library content, but what people expect of electronic resources in terms of their delivery, their usability, the services associated with them, do come from some of these most heavily visited sites, and some of us are aware of the fact that with new things like social networking sites like Facebook and places, this begs certain questions, not eBay, but certainly with Facebook and maybe parts of Yahoo, it begs questions of, do we need to put our data where our users are? Do they come to us? Does our information need to go to them? And I'm just trying to talk about the environment in which we work before we start trying to critique it and make decisions about what our options are for creating and preserving material. And the two things I know about this environment are that most of it's outside of our control in cultural heritage, and it's changing all the time. And the third thing that I know about it I already alluded to, which is that our users take and shape a lot of their expectations according to what's happening here. And so this is, these are just icons of some of the popular things where there are information resources and aggregators of information and places where people might go for discovery services. I have two versions of the Google logo on there because this one I just happened to see pop up on my computer this morning. Google turns 9 today. This suit is older than Google. So, it's just something that when we take the long view, whether we're thinking about the entire period of our own careers, whether we think about our lifetime, whether we think about the lifetime of our institutions. Those of us who are in research libraries have those kinds of viewpoints when we think about time, when we think about persistence of information and services surrounding the works in our care. Google's time frame, their entire history is 9 years old. So we're so much at the beginning stages of building services on a large scale that are truly library-like on the internet. And I think that it just was a happy coincidence to just have Google being 9 today to just really show that places that our users take for granted as the place, the model way of locating information are in fact quite young. They are changing frequently, and they may not even be around in a few years. For all we know, this will become part of that or something else. In addition to these kinds of resources that frame a context that I think we should pay attention to, or at least paying attention to it through our users, we have these kinds of services. And so Rss Feeds, and this actually comes from Marquette University, from their homepage where they're communicating with users with all of these little icons for instant messaging. And again, from my former perspective of working in preservation, we think about ultimately on a technical level, when we talk about preservation, we have to preserve data objects on some level. And the format of those objects, the atomic structure of those objects is, I think, highly driven by what people want. So if you have information that you expect to feed out to people through syndication services and through chat as a model of service, that might lead us to say we have to format our data in a very specific way in order to support that. And so the idea with just bringing up this slide at the very beginning is to suggest or to beg the question of how much our users' needs and users' expectations might influence the nature of the data that we have to create. Because when I say that this world is guaranteed to change, what I found appealing about the Emerson quote about mutability is that our user expectations change, the overarching infrastructure and model of services on the internet changes, and those of us who talk about preservation frequently talk about the need to transform data in repositories like the digital repository you have here, because if we keep data in a given format that it's made today, although it might technically still be around in a few years, it may not be compatible with the kind of service and the kind of needs that people want. So it's the relationship between people's expectations, the formats of data, and the frequency at which we have to convert our data, I think, are highly interrelated. So we, practitioners in digital preservation, take the need for change as a given. The systems and services on the front end close to our users are changing, and therefore we presume that it's only a matter of time that we have to transform data in repositories. So digital preservation requires transformations, and it's not just because of the fragility of the bits on storage and that are backed up. I think a lot of it is framed by this context of services that we may want to take advantage of, and we see these shorthand names of things like Web 2.0, Library 2.0. Well, those kinds of things that may happen at the front end, and for those of you who work in public services and who are really pushing for this kind of service and interaction with our users to make our data go where our users are and to give the kind of services where they are, that's a dialogue between the public services folks, or that's between you and yourself if you wear a public services hat and a technical services hat, to say that that kind of a stuff, when we go from this 2.0, or excuse me, when you go from 2.0 here to 3.0, that might be tantamount to saying, despite the fact that we still have formats that are readable, if we don't convert all of our data in wholesale form, it's not going to be where our users are anymore. And this is certainly one of the ways that we're talking about microfilm right now in my own organization. We still have microfilm in cool storage, backed up. We still support an infrastructure of microform readers, but we're not in a services orientation towards our primary user community where they want it that way anymore. So we're talking a lot more seriously about digitizing newspapers, although we haven't done that yet. So the whole service model and the whole environment of our users certainly shapes the assumptions that I'm sharing with you about the inevitability of change. So just as an example of how we see some of these changes manifesting themselves with the kind of material that we have in our care, let's just look at books and a few screenshots of what's happening with some books. Project Gutenberg has been around for quite a while. It's had some library participation and not library participation, but the reason I selected it here is because it's a place where there are electronic texts. It's been around for as long as I've been a librarian, since the mid-90s. But what are they featuring on their main page now? Not only that they have free books, electronic books, but that they're making them available in ebook formats. So again, it's the notion of what devices are our users? So who are our audiences? What are their needs? How does that lead us to keep our services relevant and up to date? It actually means that where these folks used to have information available only in HTML and PDF formats, they now have to have an infrastructure to make an entirely new kind of format if that's what their users want. So the world of texts keeps changing, and I would submit that if all of us look at the Project Gutenberg page 5 years from now, one, I hope that there's still a likelihood that they're still there, and two, it's going to be different. I know that. And it's not going to just be the fonts and the layout of the web page. The actual key way that they present these things that they call e-books is almost certainly going to change. It's not because HTML and PDF have become obsolete. It's because they're trying to keep pace with who their users are and what their users want. Here's good old Google, Google Book Search. Number of institutions are participating in this. Among all of the mass digitization initiatives, this one has had by far the most press. But this page, books.google.com, changes all the time. It changes not just in terms of layout, but the way that they're aggregating material. You know, Google's not a library, but all of a sudden we have these genre terms starting to appear here. This might come from Google's metadata. It might come from their relationship with OCLC, because they have all kinds of WorldCat data that are coming into the Google environment. So all I'm saying is that our users who go here are seeing, and this is only with 2 screenshots, they're seeing very different notions of quote-unquote electronic books and the services built around them. It's not just in terms of the quantity of material or the quality of material, but just in the way things are aggregated and presented to things. So these may not be libraries in terms of the way that they are administered, but they certainly are places that are making all kinds of services available. And there's the chicken and egg relationship between service and data formatting. So if you want to have a kind of discovery service that's based on genre types, you have to have the metadata to support that. Or if you have a rich set of metadata, you can build a whole bunch of services off of that. And you know, folks from OCLC research are quite eloquent in talking about all of that. In addition to Google, another mass digitization initiative is sponsored by the Open Content Alliance. The digital books being created in Open Content Alliance are all centrally going to be stored at the Internet Archive and made available centrally from an interface there. It will certainly be different from Google's. The same title, I don't know, something like Life on the Mississippi. Pick any 19th century popular title. I guarantee you it's already available here, here, and it's going to be available here, and it's going to be available maybe here, but certainly here. So let me just go through them more slowly. Mass digitization of books. This has been sort of a distributed volunteer effort of people transcribing texts in Project Gutenberg. Through library and publisher partnerships, all kinds of texts are being digitized en masse and made available in Google. The Open Content Alliance was in part a reaction to Google, where there are all kinds of participants, again, who are contributing copies of historic material to be digitized and made available. At present, these sites are not interoperable. They're not planning to make them talk to each other. So our users have to go to all of these different sites to find the different versions and use them. But I keep paying attention as a creator and potential preservation person to the different services and the attendant differences in data for both digital objects and metadata to support those. So all digital books are not alike, and the mass digitization initiatives are numerous and varying right now. Gallica, again, is sort of an anti-Google initiative in terms of things that Google wasn't going to select. They made sure at the Bibliothèque Nationale that they would select. So the head of the Bibliothèque Nationale had the perception, true or untrue, I'm not quite sure, that Google was too oriented in its selection towards Western materials and Western European, and primarily in English and North American materials. And so this is an effort coordinated by the Bibliothèque Nationale to digitize tens of thousands of volumes of text that are French imprints, as well as quite a bit of newspapers and archival materials. And then this deceptively simple interface is going to have a huge amount of content behind this as well. The big partner with Microsoft Live Book Search is Cornell University Library, and they estimate at least 1 million volumes from Cornell are going to feed into the Microsoft system. So content, all kinds of content and content genres are going to make their way to the web with or without our participation. There's a lot of printed material that's being digitized, that's going to the web right now, and the services around that are probably going to inform some of our decisions and strategies about how we create electronic versions of our material and how we intend to preserve it and what some of the requirements are for preservation. So what do some of these screenshots just about books and that first screen about commercial sites reveal? I think what they reveal to me is that there's heterogeneous content on a large and rapidly expanding scale. That's a given in the electronic environment. And if you buy my argument about user needs being informed by those kinds of sites, that we certainly can think of our users. They're always diverse, but I think that their expectations of service will be high. And some of these users, if they're stakeholders in ARL libraries, such as this one, they might have an expectation of not just the digital version being perpetuated for the long term, but having access to that in a way that's convenient to them to be perpetuated. So the distinction I'm trying to make is Project Gutenberg continues to make HTML versions of digital things available. I submit that some of our users who expect use expect more than that. It's not good enough to me that you still have this thing in its original form. What I expect of you when you say you have a commitment to preserve is that you have a commitment to make something available to me in the way that I want it to be delivered. And this is a real tension between, I think, our users and our resource allocations within our own organizations. What are the implied or implicit terms of a promise to preserve? There's a profound difference between preserving data in a given format and preserving a level of service that satisfies a demanding user's expectation. What I know, and I alluded to this a bit at the DigSeeker, Digital Curriculum, the Digital Curation Curriculum Conference, what I know and have observed among ARL libraries is that those institutions like ours that are getting into this game to acquire, to create, to preserve, and to deliver digital content are doing it by making by creating a technical environment of multiple systems and multiple services. At my institution, we don't have a single union catalog to provide access to things anymore. And what's that look like? Well, here's some slides that my colleague Stephen Abrams, the Digital Library Program Manager, made a while ago to try to have a simple set of slides that give you a view or a matrix view of how a technical infrastructure has been developed at one organization. Content is not the same. And not only are these things different in their technical nature, what the users expect of these things is different in terms of services. So electronic resources, that's really just our little euphemism here for e-journals. So when people expect article level access and services around things at the article level, there's a different nature of the unit of organization and the services for that. And then for bibliographic resources, these are books, journals, all kinds of things, visual materials, geospatial resources, archival materials, e-reserves. These are all different types of electronic content. So we have these segregated into different zones. And then we think about library services. And we can think of this sequentially in terms of acquisition, cataloging, intellectual control, repository physical control. And then what the patron cares about would be discovery and delivery. These are all of the systems now that sort of fit into that matrix. And by all means, critique this, and those of you who are technical experts, spend time with these kinds of things later on to consider in organizations like mine or like yours, are there opportunities to simplify? And I hope that there will be in the future. I mean, I hope that there will be systems where one system can be a bigger box that could accommodate a whole bunch of resources and a whole bunch of needs. But here's just a perspective of how certain content plus services have led to a huge number of systems that are segregated by function and by content type, ultimately to create blueprints for this kind of infrastructure, which takes 3 slides to show. So here's all of the ways that these systems communicate with each other for the electronic journals, the bibliographic materials, digital books, visual materials, geospatial materials, archival materials, and e-reserves. So what's that show? What that shows to me is that that type of a technical environment, and that's why I didn't want to start with those slides, because there was no context for those other than our content plus our users. I wanted to have those earlier slides to say that with heterogeneous and diverse and demanding users, we have a mandate, and as an ARL library, when we think about digital library, that's pretty high in terms of services. And so ultimately we do our best to create our own environment, and I appreciate that these environments always bring up questions of the build or buy decision. I'm not saying that all of these kinds of things have to be local. I work in an organization where most of those systems were created and managed locally. There's some commercial services that were in there. Suffice it to say that it doesn't take very long in terms of the types of services you have and the types of content you have to create an environment that pretty quickly becomes a complex one. And managing those complex environments requires, I think, diverse skill sets among staff. And the design and governance of those systems, I think, is a wonderful forum to talk about all aspects of stewardship. So when I talk about different skill sets, here's a slightly reworked version of the slide that was used when we were talking about a digital curation curriculum. And that's to just sort of divide up things into two categories here. And this isn't done artificially. This is a very real dialogue that takes place when we talk about content acquisition, system design, preservation requirements. There's often a dialogue between somebody on this side of the line and somebody on this side. These are people, these are real job titles at Harvard, where these folks have the expertise and this perspective that's primarily oriented towards content and user services. And these folks, many of whom have the words digital in their job title, are often, like these folks in particular, systems librarians and really working on architecture and hardware and software. And so I think it's a mistake to have folks like this build systems independent of knowing who the users are and what functions they're supposed to support. And so stewardship can't just be talking about systems and to say that we have to have a system to deliver electronic books. I mean, it really always, I think, takes into account a certain type of content and a certain type of user. But this is what I mean about the kind of environment. And I appreciate that I'm in a very large organization, and that's why things are so numerous here. But I think it stands to reason that if you have an environment like this, it's to be expected that you're going to have a long list of personnel. And the idea is to just indicate how I think we're at an evolutionary stage of just figuring out what kind of skill sets we need. But they are numerous, and frequently many of us have to wear many different hats. And preservation, I think, fits into all of this. I think it's highly oriented towards use and users and not just from one data perspective. So in addition to needing those skill sets to manage this kind of a complex environment, I alluded briefly to this statement of stewardship really requiring a collaboration and a dialogue among these folks. Well, what do I mean in the context of this presentation by stewardship? For electronic material, I'll borrow a term from Helen Shenton at the British Library to just think about managing this material for its entire life cycle. And life cycle management is nothing new to us. We do this all the time, that there's an assessment and selection stage. And the rest of this presentation, in fact, will be primarily in this arena of assessment. But in assessment and selection, this is of our content, of something called significant properties. That's a term that's frequently used in digital preservation literature, and use requirements. Following that, there's acquisition or creation of electronic resources. These are physical things. If we acquire or create these things, they have to be stored and managed somewhere. This is where repositories fit into the scheme of things. Within the repository, will there be some explicit set of policies and practices for preservation? Maybe. For the purpose of this talk, I'm assuming that that's a requirement. And then finally, again, what our users really care about is having the content available to them. We need services for discovery, delivery, and then both machine and human kinds of services to actually interpret and provide other kinds of services that users require. So that's just a thumbnail view of what a life cycle sort of requirement would look like. Okay, so that's my long intro, that we have mutability in the internet environment. That's the arena in which we're going to play. That it's complicated, that content really drives a lot of the systems, that user needs are incredibly relevant. And so the other part of this talk now is really about context. When we have content and when we're thinking about digital library services, under what terms do we present information to people? And I think the best way to really explore this is just by critiquing some examples. And the question that I'm trying to beg here, and not that I have any definitive answers, but I think it's an important question to beg, is when we talk about content, particularly the content that we're producing when we digitize historic materials, how do we, I'm not talking about what Google does with our metadata, I'm talking about us, for the things that we have control over, how do we want our digital library content to be discovered and delivered to our users? Well, in the beginning, there was Google image search. So let's start there. to be somewhat sarcastic. But I mean, I think a lot of our students and an increasing number of our faculty go here to find stuff. So I'm just going to simulate that for our benefit. Let's say that I have either know the name Abraham Jacobs as an American artist, or I've just heard that name. It doesn't matter what the context is. I could be taking a class. I could just be surfing the web. And if I do a search here, excuse me. I have some screenshots there just in case the internet connection went down. So let's do it. Abraham Jacobs, just a straight search for that artist, is going to bring up images. And this, right away, what we're illustrating here with this result set, begs the question of your policy at Case Western with respect to the exposure of your metadata. Are you making metadata that a search engine like Google is aware of? And if you are making metadata in a format that a search engine like Google is aware of, are you exposing it to that service? And if you are, and only if you do those two things, does your stuff fit into this larger world of material? And if I click on this image here, thumbnail image, what do I see? So I just want you guys to you know, keep me honest here. Some of this vocabulary I make up, some of it's jargon from my colleagues, but some of this is really borrowed from the kinds of information that our users are encountering. Below is the image in its original context, okay? So I think that this is really, really important that when people are discovering things, that we see a reference to a particular context. And part of the metadata that's being delivered here is this link. And this link is bringing up this particular rendering or presentation of a digitized print, quite lovely, by the way, Lilies of the Field by Abraham Jacobs. And in this particular context, what do I see? I see a whole bunch of kind of cool things that either by design, which I'll give Joanne and all of you credit for, or by accident, ends up being revealed here. I see that this image is associated with the Kelvin Smith Library, which in turn is associated with Case Western University. I also see a term here, WPA prints, and a term over here, prints from the WPA collection. Okay, so there is a context now in the way this is being presented to the web that's very, very different below this frame than above it, isn't there? And this is a library kind of context, I think. I mean, I think it's pretty unambiguous. I'm not trying to make any value judgments about it. I'm just saying that this is library context. Now, a quick, tiny aside into the anatomy of digital objects. Let's note that beneath this thumbnail, we have something called View 200 DPI image. What the heck does that mean? I don't know. All I know is that it's a link. I'm going to click it. Sweet, right? So now I can zoom in, zoom out. So my little aside on the anatomy of a digital object is when we start having a conversation, any two of us or any 22 of us, about preserving content, what's the digital object? Is the digital object this image? Is it this image plus this image? Is it those two images plus this HTML that surrounds it? Or if not literally this HTML, are we saying that in terms of what's the object, that its association with Case Western is critical? So something that I'll come back to at the end of the presentation, but I want to put it out there right now, is this question that's being begged of what are these significant properties, or what is essential? These are actual terms that you'll encounter in the literature if you think about digital preservation and you're trying to frame your own practices around it. One of the things that's there, and again I'll allude to it later, is an expectation that those of us on the technical side have of things needing to be described to us explicitly in terms of what's essential to the meaning, because I cannot look at this, if I'm a service provider for you, for digital preservation, and derive what I would have confidence would be implicitly what's important for me to preserve. Implicitly, I might conclude this image is bigger than that one. And look, as far as I'm concerned, as a technical person, the key essence of this work is the fact that I have an association between this digital image and this particular caption. That's it. So my obligation for preservation and what you're going to hold me accountable to forever is only going to be from this caption and this image. That's one implicit conclusion. I might have an obligation that's this information plus this, or I might have an obligation for some of this associated information. That's what I mean about context. And I think we're just at the beginning of building services like this that are being built just for the primary reason that they should be, for our users. So we're trying to figure out how to present ways that our users want, but that's going to have attendant ramifications in this notion of talking about preservation. I don't know, I literally don't know, through this whole series of examples that I'm about to show you, what the digital object is that must be preserved. What I do know is that there's all kinds of component things that relate to each other that are potentially meaningful. And I also know that we are the ones who created these things. These are of our own making. Now, I don't know about you, but what I find interesting here is that in this particular rendering out of Google Images, we see that presentation of the surrogate of one print, because I clicked on one thumbnail. That's logical. However, what wasn't linked to from our website, what wasn't linked to from here, was this. Was that you guys actually have a page of WPA prints in special collections. And the context from this page, which is a little bit different. Sorry, I didn't have a link to that. OK, so if we come in this way to these digital collections, and I do a little search here for, I could have searched for Abraham Jacobs. OK, now we see the Abraham Jacobs image in this context. It happens to be in the context of a larger essay prepared by Thomas Boyer. Is he here? OK, so Thomas Boyer prepared this essay. But again, what's the digital object? And what we're seeing, again, either by design or by accident, is that that result from Google Images that said WPA prints didn't include a link to this. And so there are a number of contextual elements that we surround our material with. Some of these are going to be ephemeral. Some of them need to be permanent. The question that I'm trying to beg as a matter of policy before we have practice is which? Which are the things that are essential to associate with each other? Which are the things that must be retained permanently versus the kinds of things that are ephemeral? And again, I don't believe that these are new questions to librarianship, but they become very important in the communications we're going to have between the folks who produce these kinds of things and the people who preserve them. And it's particularly important to think about this in terms of building metadata practices when we think about linking, because as we saw in this first example, there wasn't a link from one result to this. In order to get to this essay, I had to come in through your gateway. I didn't find it associated with each and every image. Not that it has to be, I'm just saying it's a choice, and those are going to have ramifications when you have an analyst do the content assessment phase that has to happen prior to preservation. What is the content? I don't know. Next example. Let's pretend that this image came to you just as an email attachment, or that it was a citation and a link. And we're sticking with the 1930s. People sorting lemons. Women sorting lemons. I think they're all women. And this particular example, brother. Let's just close this. Try it again. OK, so now we have a title of something called Sorting Lemons. And we can go to a larger image, which is kind of nice. And we have these nice services where people can zoom in and zoom out on lemons. But again, for this particular object where we see all these different views of the image, I have a caption that's associated with it here that was not associated with it here. What this caption discloses is that this was an image that's associated with the California Fruit Growers Exchange, and there's a provenance here, a statement that it was received from this exchange and that it's in Baker Library. Now, something that's not disclosed in here, but I found out by talking to the curator who was associated with this collection, is that images like this were produced by the company. This has provenance in terms of good archival practice, which is probably going to be recorded in a finding aid, but it's not recorded in this individual catalog record, that these images were made by the factory, and they often provided highly sanitized views of the workplace. So again, what's the essential contextual information that we as archivists and curators feel that we need to create for things? What I'm disclosing to you here on behalf of a Harvard library is that this is a work in progress. On each individual level, this image is fulfilling the requirements of community practice for the kind of information that you want in an image catalog record. But at a collective level of the industrial life photograph collection, it's very important to us to create a finding aid. And when we do, as I'll show you in a few minutes, I need to get moving along here, there will be links from these kinds of records to the finding aids. So again, what's the object? How much of that is important? If it was important enough for the curator to include this information, I'm going to be looking at it seriously. So information that I just shared to you in this case is different from the first example because there might be critical information to interpret this that hasn't yet been created. Well, how do I know that? If I'm in a repository and this image, which is true, is already in my digital repository, do I need to know when a finding aid is created that also relates to this 6 months from now? And if I do, does that have to inform my notion of what the essential meaning is? Are you starting to get this notion of essential characteristics, significant properties? So more quickly now, because these demanded a bit more explanation. Let's just do another example, pretending that we selected olive picking. We'll stick with agriculture, keto ranch. We see here some search results. If I were to click on one of these thumbnails, I'd get to this image. And again, we see an image here that was from a digital library. In this particular case, what's a little bit different from the Case Western University example, this is from the California Digital Library, is that I actually have some tombstone or caption information. And what I see being disclosed to me from that Google Images search is that we have a title, we have a creator, we have a more information page. I can go to that. I can see now subject information. All of this is being made available to me when I started from that. And here I see that this is part of California Cornerstones. It's part of a collection, and I can go to that collection. Also notice that it's a black and white image. What I didn't see from the link that was made is that this is created or affiliated with Alice Iola Hare, and that there is an Alice Iola Hare photograph collection. What I didn't know from this context and this representation of this image is that there is a finding aid. And if we look at this finding aid, we see that there are 304 digital objects. And one way of dealing with these kinds of things, if we look at an entire finding aid, is to provide links to images within a finding aid. And if we went through this finding aid to find the Keto Ranch, first of all, I see a nice little difference in the metadata. When I did the search on Google Images, it was olive picking. Now in this finding, so that data must have come from another database, because in this finding aid, it's called Olive King. But when I click on View Image, it in fact is, as we see here, olive picking. But I hope you notice that that's a color version, not a black and white version. So this example is showing a couple of different things. Again, we see metadata out of an image catalog system. We see a finding aid. We can infer that that's separate data in different databases. We also see different renderings of this image, leading me to infer that it was either scanned twice or that a black and white image might have been made from this one. from a preservation perspective, what do I care about? What's the object that I have to preserve, right? What's the content here? I don't know, but this is a fascinating case study when I see that this thing belongs to the Online Archive of California. It belongs to something called the Alice Iola Hare Photograph Collection. It belongs to the California Digital Library. What I didn't see is that it also is affiliated with an American Memory Collection at the Library of Congress. And I just happened to know that. But that was not disclosed in any of the metadata for many of the California sites. But I know that this thing is also part of American Memory. And in this particular case, they have a unidirectional pointer from the Library of Congress over to California, but it's not bidirectional. So who manages this content when I look at this? Is this the Library of Congress's responsibility or the California responsibility? Yes, please.
Tell Library of Congress that they've got the wrong title.
That maybe a user does, maybe somebody at a library does. And you know, I think we're on safe ground to say that olive picking is the preferred title since we actually have this in the digital image. Another example, Charles Olson Research Collection. You know, we're looking at images. This also applies to transcriptions. We have something here called the Olson Melville Project. We have a link here to a finding aid. This is from the University of Connecticut. In the finding aid, if I search, because it's not there on the left column, you know, for this, what was it called? Melville Project, I think. What I'm trying to get to is, yeah. Let me try to get there again. I'm sorry. I go to the finding aid. So again, we just saw a screenshot of a finding aid, and well, I'm going to go through this because time's short. The idea is that from here, there's a finding aid, and as we saw a moment ago, there are links to individual images from the finding aid, and these are transcribed cards that were water damaged, but Olson had some Melville materials in his library, and he was making annotations about his Melville collection. And if we look at a rendering of this card, we see this term text transcription, and this is what you get. It's not a literal transcription of the handwritten text on that card. What's going on here? This is a paper that you can find that's linked to from the project description site. They made JPEG 2000 images for those scanned images of those cards, and they put a shortened EAD finding aid into each metadata, into one of the metadata boxes in each and every JPEG 2000 file. A familiar convention to me is when images or links to images are named in a finding aid. This is the opposite. You have digital files in a repository where not the entire finding aid is in that digital image. There's a portion of that. There's all kinds of different implementation strategies that are going on here to do what? To relate, to have explicit links or relationships between metadata and content objects. So they're making an attempt here to, at Connecticut, and they're using it with JPEG 2000 to relate some information from a finding aid into a metadata box. Another example of textual materials is something from Harvard. I'm going to skip that because time's short. This one is really fascinating to me. It's the most complicated one, makes it a little bit fun, which is to look at something that is a photograph album, Muslims in China. These were photographs taken by a missionary in the 1920s and 30s. And albums have albumness, right? There's multiple pages, and there are individual images. So this is a slower presentation now, or an illustration of some of those many systems that was on that original matrix of things at Harvard. Here is a website describing a collection, and one way that we can find photographs on Muslims in China and links from here to a finding aid to the collection. In addition to, you know, so from the website we can link to a finding aid, and the finding aid system is called OASIS. Our finding aids are in their own system. So a website is in system A, the finding aid is in system B. Here's a collection level record in our bibliographic database. So what's important to note here is that again, in terms of overall context of the collection as a whole, there's a pointer from this to the finding aid, but there's not a pointer from this to the collection level record in our bibliographic database. If I look at the record in the bibliographic database, there's a link to the finding aid, but not a link to the website, because the archivist felt it was very, very important that if somebody discovers something here, they want them to go to the finding aid, which has a much richer set of contextual information than that homepage on the website does. So where do we want people to navigate to? Well, ultimately, if we put them through this system into an album, that's one thing. We also have this item level record of images in a database. And in this system, via visual information access, if I do a search here, where I haven't, if this is my starting point, not Google Images, but an actual image management system like ArtStore, but this is one that's just local to Harvard. If I search for Pickens and a region that interests me, Northwest China, whoops, and maybe limit this to, let me just do it this way. Portraits. Then what's going to come up here is another thumbnail grid of images, a little bit, you know, in concept, this is similar to Google Images. But now when I click on something like this, and I appreciate that I'm going through this quickly, but in an earlier presentation of the women sorting lemons, there was a record view. In this one, we have something called related information. And so we have an individual thumbnail image with information here about who created it and some subject material. But now here, a finding aid has been created. And in this metadata, there's an explicit link to a photograph. Excuse me, there was a link to a finding aid. And there's also a link to a photograph album. And if I click on that album, the album cover comes up. But if I go to page 20, let's see, it's the person on the horse. See, computers are so literal. How about if I do page 20 rather than sequence 20? And there's the image, okay? So when I was in an image database, there's a thumbnail here, right? So there's been systematic, you know, annihilation of people in this region for decades, so a lot of these people don't exist anymore. It's a remarkable collection. So there's the image. There's the image in the context of the album. And in looking at this, we have this thing called related links. You've already seen the collection level descriptions here. What's associated with this album is also Reverend Pickens's journal entries. Digital objects can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. And this might be some of the most compelling stuff that we want to digitize. So we have a transcription that relates to a photograph album. Photograph albums, in turn, have digital images that are on each page. How are all of these things related to each other? That's a technical implementation challenge, but the curator made that requirement, that all of these things be related to each other. And how are they preserved? Okay, so I can finish this in a couple of minutes to say that that's the end of a quick walkthrough of examples. There's many more examples of this that I wanted to show, but what I would say is that, as I hope you saw from some of these examples, digital objects, even in their simplest form, are frequently created of multiple files. A 200 DPI scan of a print and the one to the web. But obviously, it goes beyond that. Digital images, I think we should just assume that even in their simplest case, there's going to be multiple files for content and definitely associated metadata for description. Then I think we also saw from here, not only are there potentially multiple files, there might be multiple versions. We saw a grayscale version of a photograph and a color version of a photograph. And then there might be multiple contexts that we created because these things belong to the American Memory Collection and our own. And then finally, there are multiple related objects that inform a bigger context. So these things are all real-world examples of the nature of objects that we make and ways that we present them so that people can find them and interpret them. And the two questions that we technical folks have to answer in digital preservation that we really need help from good practices and good metadata production policies are: what constitutes the boundary of the object? And what are the significant properties of this thing to preserve? So I just made a screenshot of something just at the most recent SIA conference. There was a session on essential characteristics of archival preservation. You'll see this term, either significant properties or essential characteristics. Well, what's going on here? At a fundamental level, electronic content is comprised of files. And there's all kinds of obsession about formats, as there should be when we think about obsolescence and preservation. There's issues of usability. In order for things to be usable, what kind of navigation do we need to have with a multi-page text? So on the usability side, we often say that having an electronic book that's comprised of files is important, but the other thing is that this must remain full-text searchable now and into the future. If somebody has that requirement, it's totally unacceptable for us to output that content to print or to film as a preservation strategy, because what's essential to its characteristic is something of usability. But the most important mandate here is this very, very fuzzy notion of meaning, what's meaningful. And you know, as I suggested before, when we have to transform data, what we want to know and what is being documented in big research projects, Planets in the UK, and by some of the big thinkers in the field, Margaret Headstone, Cliff Lynch, Ken Thibodeau, is all kinds of folks are rightfully investing lots of time and energy in coordinated and informal fashions to try to articulate a vocabulary around explicit tags for meaning of what's meaningful. Because what are we trying to do? We're trying to avoid the mistake of compromising essential meaning when we transform these things in the future. And the purposes of this kind of metadata, and I don't know any other way to implement this without metadata, the first two are I see documented quite frequently in the literature, which are we need to fulfill this mandate to articulate significant properties or essential characteristics, perhaps to maintain look and feel. The archivists certainly want to maintain authenticity. And the other question now that I'm trying to raise, and just scratch the surface, even though it's been an hour, on this question of context. You know, in addition to context in addition to look and feel and authenticity, how do we feel about these contextual issues? And the way forward on any of this is for us to just say whether or not we care about contextual issues, and we would have to define what we mean by context. But I think associations between metadata and objects and collectionness and interpretation in addition to identification, these are big themes, and there's a rich set of examples that we can critique. So do we have to document a chain of the collection context? Do we need to think about, as the folks at UConn are trying to think about, some kind of way that we can have digital objects that are fully self-contained and self-describing? I'm not sure. And really what it comes down to in all of this is for me to leave you with some questions rather than any answers. Does context matter in the presentation of content? By the examples that I've seen from multiple institutions, it certainly seems to matter. Is context an essential characteristic or significant property of a content object? And if it is, does context also matter in the preservation of these objects? If so, I think when we really turn to issues of implementation, we're going to have ramifications in our policies and practices with respect to naming, metadata for all of these reasons, for all of these types of metadata, when we canonicalize or normalize formats, when we bring them into repositories or think about migration strategies. Again, we might have to think about significant characteristics. That's where look and feel issues might be more important than others. But image formats, for example, can contain all kinds of encoded textual information, like the names of creators and authors and persistent links and names of collections. So it really begs the question, when we are creating or transforming objects, how much metadata we want and where we might put it. So if we think of opportunities of creating self-contained objects, it might be possible to make use of standards and practices to incorporate that kind of a function into the acquisition stage when we normalize data to bring into a repository, or a migration stage later. But the big issue, I think, is really some policies and practices for stewardship. What are the things that we care about, not just in what we build today, but what components of those must remain associated with the objects into the future? Thanks very much. Too many examples, as always. So, questions about this or other aspects of the topic? Yes, please.
The idea of context is challenging to me, because it seems like one of these onion things where there's always a context for the context for the context.
That's right.
You can start off talking about the original work, whatever it is, and then just start layering out there depending on what your particular definition of what's relevant is. And then what you collect over time as new things come along that weren't available earlier, how do you provide the links to them? And it may seem to you that this is the context, but then people emerge someplace who have had a history with that object, and they enter their testimony or their related things that would bring meaning to an understanding of the object that you didn't know about at the time.
That's right.
So
That's right.
It's kind of like you could talk about your blue blazer being the thing, but if you live in a house with cats, there's a wider context that's going to be collected on a daily basis.
Yep, I think, and I agree with you. I agree with all of that, and that's why I was making my best effort to have us look at real-world examples of the multiple ways that libraries are deciding to deliver material. So we have control each and every time. We're only intervening. We're only taking action when we want to. So, and we're primarily taking action to describe, organize, and deliver things when we make digital websites, or when we code a finding aid, or when we make a catalog record. So we have control as administrators, or as the folks who actually do the work, of deciding where we want to invest our energies. And all I was trying to show in these examples is, as we consider where we invest our resources in these necessary acts of acquisition, physical control, intellectual description, bear in mind that the things that were part of your decision making, what entered into your decision making as to how much metadata to create, or how many links to put in there, or how many versions to make it a digital camera, whatever's in your thinking in those decisions isn't being communicated implicitly to the preservation service providers. So people who are thinking about preservation, these data objects, to my mind, are not communicating to me what the boundaries are of that material and what it is that I have and that I'm supposed to preserve. And so it's a scoping question, I think, not an interpretation question. I'm pretty agnostic personally on this issue of quality and usability, because I don't know enough about users yet. I don't know if this level of description with 3 links is any better than that level that didn't have it. What I do know is that here at Case Western University, you have the exact same image that's represented with an essay around it, and that's represented with just tombstone caption information around it. I also know that the WPA collection, which is an exhibit on your site right now, might go away in a few years, but I think it's unlikely that the Kelvin Smith Library, Case Western University, or maybe even that digital image is going to go away. So as we look into the future, or can we look into the future when we make our proximate decisions of how much metadata to create and when we write essays? And really it becomes an organizational challenge of to what extent do we want to try to set up ways that we communicate with each other and have some of that expressed in the metadata with our objects, so the people who preserve things don't make the mistake of leaving things out of the preservation chain, or saying, my obligation here was really just to preserve the digital image. So when I did a format transformation, there was stuff internal to that file, like the name of the collection and a link to your website. Well, I stripped all of that out, because what's really important is that for all of my other customers, that I don't change the size of the image, that I preserve the color space. You see what I'm saying? So this notion of essential characteristics and significant properties, I think that there's a great deal of latitude according to the view of the beholder. So I might interpret this object as containing this stuff, and you might have had an interpretation that it contains that. At the end of the day, I think the buck stops on the director's desk. from an institutional perspective, sorry, Joanne, but from an institutional perspective, what are the kinds of things that we value? And perhaps something that we really value that I'm not seeing incorporated into the practices at my own institution, maybe what we really value is an explicit association between descriptive information about content and the content object. Well, in our world right now, and there's long reasons for this, we actually manage these things in separate systems. We have digital images in that repository. We have finding aids in that one. We have granular item level description records in that one. If we don't talk about context and really champion its values, then people aren't going to have a mandate to make those systems talk to each other and to have certain components of metadata become parts of objects. Because I think lacking any explicit directions from us, people who provide preservation services, they're going to start from what they have and try to preserve the bits. But that's not the same as preserving essential meaning or preserving everything that's needed for a given service. Yes, please.
Something you hinted at in your last slides, and I think you said the word once, which is a technical term, which is in standards. So, in computer languages or something like that, then at some point in the process, stakeholders get together and set standards for communication.
Yep.
You're sort of hinting at that as the way forward there, although you didn't, as I say, you didn't use the word, at least in the text there. Do you see a standards being set for various sets of metadata and so on? And if so, do you see a way forward to who's going to set the standards, who's going to drive that process, what it should be? And if you get to that point, then do you see the possibility of some of this being automated so that...
Oh, yeah. So standards, I'm just a purist coming out of a preservation background to think that standards and best practices are not synonymous. So standards have to come from places like the International Standards Organization, ANSI. So the existing forums in which there's an appropriate vetting process and participation in creating technical standards. I think the technical standards...
I'm not talking about technical standards.
Okay.
I'm talking about, standards for...
Like standard practices.
Context
yeah.
and things like that. Exactly what you were talking about,
yeah.
which is completely
there's two,
different
right.
than
so there's two things. I mean, standards matter. When we think of things like HTTP and OAI, the Open Archives Initiative, as a protocol for exchanging. So there are going to be really important technical standards to just ensure that we can have systems that talk to each other and that we can move data around. But what do you mean like standard practices then?
I mean that if you're going to put something up, then you
yep.
owe also the following type of information about it. If you're
yeah.
going to convert, then it is your obligation to convert
yeah.
all this information.
Yeah, I think...
we're formalizing best practices.
That's right. That's right. I think that right now I'm comfortable with the notion of trying to get those things shaped locally. I think that it's really, really difficult to communicate. I really do. And I think that a really important starting point is to say, within your own organization, what key functions need to be met from a public services perspective, from a discovery perspective, from a preservation perspective. But when we have to implement this stuff, I think it's going to be about metadata creation. And I think some of those local practices about metadata standards that we should use and the ways and the policies and practices we build around them, I think come from our just being opportunistic when we're either purchasing pre-existing software or we're making our own systems for things like encoding finding aids. I think most of us use some sort of version of the EAD schema. So I think we're at a point where for a lot of digital information, there are existing standards that really come into play when we're talking about building our own systems, and where the question I'm trying to beg here, particularly at an institution like mine that has data in a lot of different systems, is locally, I can already see that we have inconsistent ways in which we point from one data object to another. Does that matter to anybody? And if it does matter to anybody, then what we can do locally with the systems that we create in our organization and then report out in talks like this or at the Digital Library Federation, we could, for example, if you control a repository for metadata and digital objects, set up gatekeeper functions with software. and you can say, these objects that are going to come into my repository must be validated, and this field can't be empty. Or if there's a field that must be present, it's only one of these allowable values. Computers are pretty smart. If we use local practices for consistent IDs of naming objects, we might say, in this finding aid, if I have an explicit link to an ID, then I have a system that looks in all of the other Harvard systems that I control to see if that ID is present and makes an automatic link. But I think you can appreciate from this long answer why I have some guarded optimism in some of this being evaluated and perhaps standardized only at a local level. Because our systems are different from your systems. They just are. I mean, and so I think who controls the systems has a good opportunity to create and enforce policies around those systems, particularly in the area of validation, and then also crawling your various sites, making use of harvesting. And what do we want to use harvesting for? We might use harvesting not only to aggregate WPA scans from 5 institutions for our patrons. We might want to do it for ourselves for purposes of quality control and automatic discovery of new editions. So if Case Western has 3 discovery systems, wouldn't it be nice if they could be queried to see have we copied data in different systems, and if so. But we're just at the beginning of this, and I think at a local level, that's a really, really important place to start. Somebody's creating these digital exhibits at Case Western. There's also a digital repository. If any of these digital objects are going into your digital repository, I think that's a wonderful opportunity to get those stakeholders into a room and to have a discussion about when we make things like exhibits, are they ephemeral or not? And if we want to document them, where can we put that metadata? And you might not have a place to put it yet. And then that leads to an expansion of object modeling for repositories, and that's kind of where we're going. But I was really trying to avoid the technical implementation stuff. It took long enough to just try to use examples to frame a set of questions. And I was sincere when I said, I really don't know, and I'm not presuming for the sake of this talk, that context does matter as much as look and feel. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. All I know is that people are underwriting these research investigations to try to develop a vocabulary for things like significant properties and essential characteristics. And it seems very technically oriented, and it doesn't seem, from the way that I've been looking at it, to be accounting very much for things like finding aids, essays, website text, any sort of interpretive information that we create. And that might be really important for the type of understanding that we want people to have of objects. I think a lot of digital sites that I look at from libraries create a way that we want people to look at things so they don't see things, quote unquote, out of context. Well, what does that mean? And I just don't know of a place. I wish I knew of an institution that I could have pointed to that would say, this seems to be an organization that really cares about this question and is modeling a way forward. But I keep hearing about significant properties, essential characteristics, and I thought that if I could say something new and taking advantage of this wonderful invitation to be here, I'd try to put out challenges that are not just challenges within my own organization, but I think maybe community ones. Yes, please.
I would submit that context is a mutable cloud.
Yep.
And I've been struggling with this since '84 when we had a joint project with IBM about what is a collection.
Exactly.
And a collection is what an individual user considers related materials at any point in time, and that can change. That picture of the lilies in the field could also be part of costuming in the 1930s, or working men at leisure, or depression, or anything else, which would then link it to a whole different series of images. So the key is, if metadata can do it, is to have those permanent hooks which will connect it to anything that could possibly be relevant in the future, including color.
Right, but this is just like, there's 2 quick replies that I have to that. One quick reply is that if that's true, if we start taking into account, because I didn't for the sake of this talk, if we start taking into account this notion that any query that I submit against metadata, that the results of that query comprise a collection, and I'm perfectly willing to accept that, that's fine. But then that begs the question that's exactly the same that I hear about website preservation all the time, about web archiving. Where, as a matter of policy and practice, where do you define a boundary? That's all you have to do, right? You have to define a boundary of where it is. But I just wanted to, I probably wasn't clear on this. What I wanted to say is that For this talk, I'm interested only in critiquing the stuff that we impose. It's not mutable when we are actually deciding not only to put a caption into an image-level database, but also to create a finding aid and also to create a website within our own institution. I'm only saying that. Just within our own institution, when these things emerge, there's not necessarily a full linking among these things. And whether there's a full linking or not, it doesn't matter. From the preservation perspective, there are going to be trade-offs when our service providers transform our data. And I think a really important question that we have to disclose, and maybe it's through a policy agreement, maybe it doesn't happen at the atomic level of the metadata, is which elements of this stuff can we afford to lose? So if we have to give up something in transformations in the future, maybe that's sort of a high-level policy that would say, as long as you preserve the images, I don't care what happens to the links. But your point is absolutely right, that there's...
Only as a campus, when
Yep.
for most users, that's hardly even a starting place. They've already started beyond
Absolutely,
us.
absolutely. But I'm thinking about, right, and I'm thinking about the future and thinking about the long term, not today's users, because today's users are being accommodated by multiple discovery services, which is wonderful. That's why I'm starting off my whole talk about preservation, where I'm in a reactionary position. I'm reacting to what we're all doing for use, and that has consequences on the data objects we make and the metadata and the links. And what's, I think, a challenge is to, whether it's human-to-human communications or object metadata or policies, is to disclose of all the possible links and all the possible sort of boundaries that are around this stuff, what's most important for me to be paying attention to when I preserve it. And in the literature, I keep encountering mandates to preserve look and feel and to come up with some taxonomies for usability that we aren't using yet. Like, we have an ebook in this repository, and its key attribute is that it's full-text searchable, right? We're not explicitly encoding that. Somebody might say within an organization, I'll have a query against these 3 fields, and I'll infer from that format type and that level of indexing that searchability is important. But it's not explicitly being encoded to say that when this object or when these components of this object go into your repository, here's what must be carried forward into the future. And some of that might just be a metadata trail, that it's perfectly acceptable to take down exhibits whenever we want. But if machines could automatically tag every one of those digital files, masters in particular, that on this particular date it was associated with this URL, maybe that's good enough. And then somebody in a paper file 20 years from now says, at September 2007, that URL was associated with this thing called WPA prints. So for the scholarly record and the scholarly trail, what's the stuff that we can afford to let fall away, and what's the stuff that we have to preserve? And a lot of that can be encoded and built into the operations of workflows. But I have no agenda or to advance on where collections begin and where collections end. I mean, that's a mess. It's highly mutable. You said it perfectly. Context is a mutable cloud. Was there another question? Yep.
Well, I just think as I was thinking through this, that it's interesting comparing how traditional institutions like libraries and publishers create, disseminate information, create relationships. In a lot of ways, I think that's very, talking about context of an online material and its relationship to other things, I think it's similar to having a book and liner notes inside a book. And,
yeah.
Is that information, or is that just the words on a page and an image information?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of debate's been going on for years. But what I think is interesting in the current, what people are calling the Web 2.0 type of framework, where there's a social context being created, and is that something institutions need to be paying attention to?
That's right.
And looking to preserve and looking to make relevant to institutional content? Because here, what we're doing, we're just taking institutional content, repurposing it, and but we're not really going out and getting social context and that users are creating, non-institutions are creating, and that, I think, kind of opens up the floodgates for this conversation as to what is important and what's not.
No, it's absolutely right. And again, I think it's just, I've been around too many systems librarians to have a good neutral perspective anymore. But they've just sort of poisoned me with the notion that object modeling is the most important part of these discussions. And when I go to the Digital Library Federation, there's a lot of IT perspectives and too few of the service perspectives about this. But at the end of the day, I think in terms of when we talk about repositories, what comprises the object. I mean, somehow we have to have a local definition of that, and then it potentially becomes flypaper. Once you've defined that, all kinds of things can stick to it, or it can be kryptonite, all kinds of things can bounce off it. It's really up to you. And that's right. I mean, if there's uses and our lawyers permit us to collect certain types of metadata that are anonymous with respect to tags and users, or at least user locations, there's any number of ways that machines can start collecting all kinds of information, but that's where I think relationships are so important. What's the unit level that we are going to assign as the primary meaning of a certain aggregation of files, right? And that's where we have to build policies for preservation on retention. So we've already done this within our own repository. There are certain rules for certain types of files that associate with an ID where we make it impossible for the curatorial owners to delete them. There's certain files that can never be deleted. And so if you have sort of the flypaper notion, if you have open systems and it's your systems where you can populate more and more information that's in there, just in case there's a future possible service that can be built off of that data for a future sociologist that hasn't even been born yet. It would be really wonderful to see what kinds of uses were made of this article other than just the tried and true citation analysis. You might have a repository of that data. Has it been preserved or not? It's really going to depend on whether it was associated properly with the object, which might have been an article, and whether policies ensured that certain pieces would not be lopped off. And there's not explicit rules that are being built around this stuff yet. Yes, please.
In the spirit of exploration, at least, you might say that one way to attack the problem you're talking about what's important to users and what contextual information would be to let the users themselves interact with the system. Yeah. So we usually think of this big separation between archives and systems that permit interactivity.
Yeah.
But many experts, no doubt, are using particular collections and so on, and might have information such as you had about this image is also in a collection such and such. So is anybody exploring permitting this kind of interactivity where users would have a space or something like that, and they could say, here's a related piece of contextual information that I am proposing be attached to this file, short of sending an email to
the National Library of Australia, I think it was the National Library, not the National Archives. Does anybody know about this project a couple of years ago where a meaningful percentage of images that they had with item level cataloging, like some of the ones that we looked at here, they opened up for tagging. And they have encouraged users to tag. They are collecting those tags. But I don't know whether they are doing that, whether they have had an internal conversation to say, those of us who are interested in what users want, we're going to collect this information and see what we can learn about things, see if the objects are enriched or not enriched. Wonderful thing to investigate. But did the preservation people, and I don't know the answer to this, have a question to say, okay, not only are you going to be doing that for the next 2 years, as you open this up, and this has been done in a very, this is at a national level. They have a mandate to serve the entire nation. There was good advertising. It's persistent. They've been doing this for a couple of years. They're collecting a lot of information. But on a policy level, I didn't know if they wanted to shape their back-end systems to say when we collect this information, are we going to populate our databases? Yes or no? And if we populate our databases, is that information going to go into our repository? Yes or no? And if it does go into our repository, is it going to have the same level of retention and the same value as the information that we created? So I think that these are wonderful questions, and just expanding the number of people who have a stake in the meaning just complicates this all that much more, right? But knowing what users want, I think you're absolutely right. And the first example that came to mind is that one with images from the National Library of Australia. I know that there are, some, but that's a public institution. So in the world of private or research libraries, I'm not sure how much people are doing that. Somebody must be there.
There is a project.
Yeah, thank you. I knew somebody would know.
We are discussing locally here with the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, which is hosted at Case Western Reserve.
Yeah.
It's a set of very scholarly articles relating to Cleveland history, but we've also had some discussions with them about having a set of additional features in which people could, in effect, annotate the articles with their own memories. That's sort of a written oral history kind of thing. Whether it actually proceeds or not remains to be seen, but we've at least had the discussion. So it gives a different kind of context, but the editor is quite firm in his belief that the scholarly, well, let me say it another way. We would not open it up as a wiki, the whole thing, that the scholarly articles would remain as scholarly articles, and the additional context would be alongside it.
Yeah. I guess, now that I'm thinking about, your feedback here, and it's helping me just appreciate that yes, I know, for the sake of a talk, things like context, content sound a bit glib, and bringing Emerson into this. I think if I go back to sort of the things that were concerning me when I thought about this talk, and if nothing else, I think I'd like to have this sort of be some concluding thoughts on this, is that it's arguable that preservation is not just a technical arena. That digital preservation arguably is not just to talk about technical attributes and strictly in the realm of IT. So that's one thing that I think concerns me. I mean, so much of what I'm reading and so many of the initiatives that I participate in seem to be so dominated by a perspective of looking at these things as data and files. But there's a human and interpretive context to all of this that may or may not be important. So that's just one thought. And the second thought is that I think that there's a profound relationship between use at any given time and the values that we have of the information in our care. I mean, and I think that when we're making all kinds of decisions about what's important enough to digitize, and within that world, what's important enough to create metadata for at a highly granular level versus at a more abstract level, what's the stuff that's really important enough to permit to be harvested so that it can be shared and discovered in multiple institutions. People in our organizations are making all of those decisions for the benefit of the user, and I really feel that there's a possibility to have some of those decisions be communicated to the technical people who do transformation, and that there are automated ways, one hopes, to have the systems that we control put that information into a centrally managed database for the possibility that it will be useful information in the future. So digital preservation is complicated enough, I know that, but I think if things just keep going forward the way they are, we might have all kinds of data that we collect where we succeed in preserving the files, but fail in preserving the essential meaning. And that we succeed in preserving the content, but fail to have an adequate record in the future of the level of context that we were aware of and that we controlled. I'm not talking about getting logs from Facebook. I'm not talking about monitoring what our users do. I'm just saying the stuff that we control. And I think that those were the original concerns. And it sounds like that from the discussion that there's some interest in, from a digital library perspective, to debate this topic, because it really is something where it brings in all kinds of value systems that although there's a sound reason to create different levels of description and relationships and multiple files, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a mandate to collect and preserve all of that stuff. I mean, there's going to be hard choices about what we can preserve and can't preserve, and that's why I said at the end, I know I was going quickly, that I have no way, I know of no way that any of us can try to implement strategies to create any kind of hierarchy of values without fundamentally bringing this into a metadata realm at some point, or multiple metadata realms. So in the usual realms of discussion for descriptive metadata and structural metadata and preservation metadata, can some of these contextual needs be turned into some sort of, field level descriptions that we can collect information. And if it can't, we just won't collect this stuff into our systems, and we'll succeed in preserving pages of books, but not necessarily fully searchable books whose collections that we knew of 20 years ago and how many people use them. It might be nice to preserve those things, particularly if we can do it in an automatic way. Anything else? been here for a while. I really appreciate your staying, and I guess I'm here for a little while more, and you had my email address, and if you want to challenge me, correct me, or just have other information or questions answered about Harvard or our practices, please contact me at any time. It's really been a pleasure to visit. Thanks a lot.